My name is Michael, I'm 38, and up until that night, I believed my marriage to Cindy was unshakable. We were the couple people admired, the stable pair in our friend group. Or so I thought. It was a quiet Wednesday evening. I just finished fixing the dishwasher, feeling pretty accomplished for someone who usually left those kinds of jobs to the professionals. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the detergent I'd spilled earlier, but the satisfaction of crossing another task off my to-do list was enough to distract me. As I packed up the tools, Cindy's voice floated in from the next room. At first, I didn't pay much attention. She was always chatting with her friends about something. Dinner plans, a work event, or someone's birthday. It was her tone that caught my ear this time, low and cautious in a way that made me pause. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked. Her words were just loud enough to carry through the thin wall. No, Henry's not coming. He's not the jealous type." I froze. Jealous? I didn't even know that word applied to me. Cindy never described me like that, not to my face. A knot began to form in my stomach, but I told myself to keep calm. Maybe I'd misheard her. Maybe she wasn't talking about me. "Molly's wedding is the perfect excuse," she continued. "No one will suspect anything. Stop worrying, Jack." "Jack?" My grip tightened on the screwdriver in my hand, my knuckles white as my heart sank. I ran through the names of all the men we knew. Jack wasn't one of them. It wasn't a coworker she'd mentioned or a friend from the gym. The knot in my stomach twisted into something sharper. The conversation ended abruptly, and I heard her walking toward the doorway. I hadn't even realized I was standing there, halfway between the kitchen and the living room. When Cindy stepped into the hall and saw me, she hesitated. It was just for a second, a flash of something unreadable in her expression before she smiled. Too quickly, too bright. "This is Molly," she said, holding up her phone like it was evidence. "We're discussing wedding details." The words hung in the air, hollow and brittle. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But the way she said it, with that forced casualness, was like a badly rehearsed line in a play. My mind replayed the name she'd spoken on the phone. Jack. It didn't match with the narrative she was spinning now. "Right?" I said slowly, forcing a small nod. "Molly's wedding." Cindy's eyes darted to the floor for just a moment before she brushed past me, heading for the living room. She turned on the TV, flipping through the channels as if nothing had happened. I lingered in the hallway, still gripping the screwdriver, my thoughts racing. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain how I knew, but the pit in my stomach refused to go away. I replayed the conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every tone. It wasn't like Cindy to lie, at least not to me. Or had I just been too blind to notice before? That night, as we climbed into bed, I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. She acted normal, too normal. She was on her phone for a while, scrolling aimlessly before setting it down on the nightstand. I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, her words echoing in my head. "No one will suspect anything." When her breathing evened out and I was sure she was asleep, I turned my head and stared at her. She looked peaceful, like nothing in the world was troubling her. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't really know this woman anymore. I didn't know her at all. The next morning started like any other. The sun streamed through the blinds, and the faint smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen signaled that Cindy had already started her day. As I walked into the bedroom, though, something caught my eye. Her open suitcase sat on the bed, half filled with clothes. It didn't make sense. The wedding wasn't for 4 more days, and Molly's family lived in town. There was no need to pack this early. My eyes flicked to the contents of the suitcase, and my chest tightened when I spotted it. Nestled among her folded jeans and tops was a box of luxurious lingerie, still sealed. I picked it up, my fingers brushing the smooth packaging. Cindy had never worn anything like this for me, not even on our anniversary or those rare getaways where I tried to rekindle something between us. My stomach churned with unease. "What's this?" I asked, holding the box up as she walked back into the room. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Cindy froze for a split second, her eyes darting from the box to my face. Then she let out a light laugh. the kind of laugh people use when they're trying too hard to seem unbothered. "Oh, that? It's for the bachelorette party?" she said, snatching the box from my hand. "A giveaway game, you know? One of those silly things." I watched her closely, the way her fingers tightened around the box, and her voice carried a hint of defensiveness despite her casual tone. It was like watching a magician perform a trick, distracting you with one hand while hiding something with the other. I nodded slowly, pretending to accept her explanation. "Right, the party." "Yeah," she said quickly, shoving the box into the suitcase and zipping it shut. "Don't overthink it, Michael." The words lingered in the air, heavy with irony. I wanted to confront her, to call out the lie I knew was hanging between us, but something stopped me. If I pushed too hard now, I'd lose any chance of finding out the truth. So I swallowed my frustration and forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as fake as it felt. Later that day, while Cindy was at the store, I sat in the kitchen staring at my coffee cup, replaying the scene in my head. The doubts that had been gnawing at me since the night before had only grown louder. Her phone call, the name Jack, the suitcase, the lingerie, all the little things that seemed harmless on their own were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. That's when an idea struck me. I grabbed her car keys from the hook by the door and walked out to the driveway. Cindy's car was a newer model, equipped with GPS, and I knew it stored her recent destinations. My hands trembled slightly as I turned on the ignition and navigated through the system. It didn't take long to find it. An address 80 miles south. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. We didn't know anyone down there. No friends, no family. The wedding was nowhere near that area. So why had she been there? And who was she meeting? Without giving myself time to overthink, I jotted down the address, grabbed my jacket, and headed out. I told myself it was probably nothing, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew better. The drive felt endless. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. What if it really was nothing? What if I was letting my imagination ruin my marriage? But then I thought about the way Cindy had grabbed that lingerie box, the hesitation in her voice when she explained it away. No, this wasn't nothing. As I neared the address, the scenery changed. The highway gave way to quiet suburban streets lined with neat lawns and modest houses. My pulse quickened when I spotted the house at the end of the road. A blue sedan was parked in the driveway, its shiny exterior catching the afternoon sunlight. I recognized it immediately. Jack's car. The knot in my stomach tightened as I pulled over a few houses down, far enough to avoid drawing attention but close enough to see everything. The house was unremarkable. A standard single-story home with white shutters and a neatly trimmed hedge. But knowing who lived there made it feel sinister. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, my eyes fixed on the driveway. Part of me wanted to march up to the door and demand answers, to confront Cindy and this Jack face to face. But another part of me hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if there was an innocent explanation? Just as I was about to leave, the front door opened. My breath hitched as Cindy stepped outside, her familiar figure instantly recognizable even from a distance. She was laughing at something Jack said as he followed her out, a grin plastered across his face. They stood close, too close, their body language more intimate than I could stomach. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I sat, but I didn't need to. The way she tilted her head, the way he reached out to touch her arm, it was all the confirmation I needed. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I forced myself to stay still, to keep watching, even as my chest burned with rage. Eventually, they said their goodbyes. Cindy got into her car and drove off, heading back to the life we shared. A life that suddenly felt like a lie. When Jack disappeared back into the house, I sat there for a while longer, staring at the now empty driveway. The questions swirling in my head were almost unbearable. How long had this been going on? How many lies had she told me? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? By the time I started the car and drove home, I had no answers. Just a sinking feeling that my world was unraveling faster than I could hold it together. Saturday arrived, and Cindy was up early, bustling around the house. She was cheerful, even humming to herself as she packed a small overnight bag. It struck me how at ease she seemed, as if there wasn't a single crack in our lives. But I knew better. She kissed me on the cheek before heading to the door. "I'll probably be back late tomorrow," she said. "The bachelorette party is going to run long, and Molly wants us all to stay at her parents' house. You'll be fine, right?" I nodded, offering a faint smile. "Yeah, of course. Have fun." It was a lie. There was no part of me that felt fine. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my jacket and keys, slipping out to my own car. I stayed far enough behind her to avoid suspicion, my hands gripping the wheel as my heart thudded in my chest. She didn't head toward the wedding venue. In fact, she drove in the exact opposite direction, away from the charming town Molly's parents lived in and down toward a quieter, less populated area. Every turn she took, every mile she covered, only confirmed what I already feared. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her car slowed and turned into a familiar driveway. Jack's house. I parked a few houses down, barely breathing as I watched her through the windshield. Cindy didn't get out of the car immediately. She sat there for a moment, looking into the rearview mirror. Then, to my shock, she began to change. From the front seat of her car, Cindy slipped out of her casual outfit, sweatpants and a loose hoodie, and into something that made my stomach churn. An elegant black dress, the kind you'd wear to a cocktail party or a fancy dinner. The fabric hugged her curves in a way that made my throat tighten. I realized, with a sickening jolt, that I'd never seen that dress before. She ran her hands through her hair, smoothing it down, then reapplied her lipstick using the car mirror. Every movement was deliberate, practiced, like someone preparing for a date. Jack appeared at the front door. He was dressed sharply in a crisp shirt and slacks, his hands in his pockets as he scanned the street. He was waiting for her. Cindy stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. My stomach twisted as I watched Jack walk up to her with a smile. He hugged her first, pulling her close in a way that felt far too intimate. Then, as if to drive the knife deeper, he kissed her on the cheek. I felt the air leave my lungs, replaced by a sharp, unrelenting pain in my chest. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, struggling to keep myself together as I watched the scene unfold. They didn't linger outside for long. Jack opened the door for her, and she stepped inside without a second glance at the world around her. The door closed behind them, shutting me out and leaving me sitting in my car, drowning in silence. For a while I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the crushing reality of what I just witnessed. There was no more room for doubt. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a coincidence. Cindy had made her choice, and it wasn't me. A part of me wanted to storm up to the house, to bang on the door and confront them both right then and there. But as I stared at the darkened windows, another part of me hesitated. What would that accomplish? Would she deny it, twist the truth like she had before? Would Jack mock me, smug and unbothered by the mess he'd helped create? Instead, I stayed in my car, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of what to do next. Cindy wasn't just lying to me. She was living a life I wasn't part of, and now that life was unfolding behind that closed door. Time passed, though I barely noticed. Minutes turned into an hour, then 2. My mind replayed the moment Jack kissed her on the cheek, the way her smile had been so natural, so comfortable in his presence. It made me feel like a stranger in my own marriage. Eventually, I forced myself to start the car and drive away. I didn't want to see what would happen when they came back out, didn't want to imagine the kind of night Cindy had planned. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and pain. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house felt colder, emptier than it ever had before. I sat there for a long time, staring at the darkened windows and trying to convince myself I could find a way to fix this. But deep down, I knew there was no going back. Something had broken, and no amount of effort would put it back together again. Cindy wasn't who I thought she was, and now I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. Cindy's image, stepping into Jack's house in that dress, played on a loop in my mind. Her laugh, his smirk, the kiss. It all felt like an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. By morning, my anger had solidified into something sharper, colder. I wasn't just going to let this happen. I needed proof, something irrefutable. That afternoon, I stopped by an electronics store and picked up a small recording device. It was discreet, easy to use, and just the tool I needed to uncover the truth. My hands trembled as I paid for it, the weight of what I was about to do settling over me like a heavy cloak. The drive to Jack's house was eerily quiet. My thoughts were loud enough to drown out the hum of the engine. By the time I arrived, my resolve was unshakable. I parked a few houses down and made my way to the front of his property, keeping to the shadows. Every step felt like a risk, my pulse quickening as I approached the door. The microphone was small enough to fit into a corner of the porch, just beside a potted plant near the door. I crouched down, keeping one eye on the house as I secured it in place. The whole operation took less than a minute, but it felt like hours. By the time I was back in my car, parked at a safe distance, my hands were slick with sweat. I stared at the house, half expecting Jack or Cindy to come storming out, demanding to know what I was doing. But the door remained closed, the house quiet and still. Hours passed as I waited, the device picking up the faint hum of their conversations. I couldn't hear much from where I was, but I knew I'd hear everything when I retrieved the recording. That evening, as the sky darkened and the porch light flicked on, I saw movement behind the curtains. Laughter filtered through the open window, light and carefree. It made my stomach churn. I watched as Jack stepped out onto the porch briefly, phone in hand, before retreating inside again. The way he moved so casually, so comfortably, infuriated me. This wasn't just some fling to him. He was staking a claim to a part of Cindy I didn't even know existed. By the time I returned home later that night, I felt like I was carrying the weight of 100 unanswered questions. Sitting at my desk, I plugged the recorder into my computer and hit play. Their voices were clear, unmistakable. Cindy's laugh came first, light and mocking, followed by Jack's deeper tone. "Henry doesn't suspect anything at all," Cindy said, her voice tinged with amusement. "Really?" Jack replied. There was skepticism in his tone. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," she said with a confidence that made my chest tighten. I even put the underwear in the suitcase right in front of him, and he didn't understand anything. They both burst into laughter, a sound that felt like a dagger plunging into my back. My hands clenched into fists as I listened to them joke about me like I was some clueless fool, too blind to see what was right in front of me. Every word was a new stab, each one twisting the knife deeper. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was mocking me, stripping me of every ounce of dignity I thought I had left. Jack chuckled. "You've got him wrapped around your finger, huh?" "Completely," Cindy said, her voice dripping with smugness. "He wouldn't believe it even if he saw it with his own eyes." I slammed my fist down on the desk, the sharp sound echoing through the empty house. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as the recording continued, their laughter cutting through me like glass. By the time the audio ended, I was trembling. I couldn't tell if it was from anger or heartbreak, or maybe both. The woman I had loved for years, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was treating me like a joke. I sat there in the dark, the recording still playing in my head even after I turned it off. The weight of the betrayal was crushing, but the humiliation, the way they laughed at me, was unbearable. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. The pain, the sorrow, the confusion. They were still there, but now they were joined by something colder, something that whispered for retribution. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 2 days passed, but they felt like an eternity. Every second was a battle against the storm inside me. The recording played on a loop in my mind, their laughter haunting me even in my sleep. I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything except Cindy and Jack. The betrayal felt like a physical weight on my chest, crushing me with every breath. By the time Cindy came home that evening, I was ready. I was done waiting, done pretending I didn't know. I stood by the door, arms crossed, my jaw tight. She walked in with her usual air of nonchalance. her bag slung over her shoulder and her phone in hand. She didn't notice me at first, too absorbed in whatever she was scrolling through. "Cindy?" I said, my voice steady but cold. She looked up, startled by my tone. "Oh, you scared me. What's up?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at her, my silence stretching long enough for her to shift uncomfortably. Finally, I said, "I know everything." Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. "You were at Jack's," I said, cutting straight to the point. "I saw it. I heard you." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then she quickly recovered, her expression hardening as she shifted to defense. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice rising. "It's exactly what I think," I snapped, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. "Don't insult me by lying again, Cindy. I saw you. I followed you. I heard every word you said." The weight of my accusation hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she tried a new tactic, deflection. "Henry," she said, her tone turning accusatory, "you were always busy working, always at the office, always distracted. You didn't notice me. Jack did. He listened to me. He made me feel alive." Her words hit like a slap. I took a step closer, my voice trembling with anger. "Alive?" I shouted. "Alive? Cheating on me? Alive? Laughing behind my back? Alive? Spending our money on him?" Her eyes flickered with guilt for a split second before she crossed her arms, her expression turning defiant. "You don't understand," she said, her voice hardening. "You weren't there, Henry. You didn't see how lonely I was. Jack, he just filled a void you created." I felt my hands shaking, fists clenching at my sides. "So it's my fault now? You destroy our marriage, and somehow I'm the one to blame." "I'm not saying that," she said, but the look in her eyes said otherwise. "I'm saying you left me no choice. I tried, Henry. I tried to make this work. But you were too focused on everything else to see me." I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the room. "You tried? Is that what you call this? Sneaking around, lying to my face, mocking me to him? That's what trying looks like to you." She hesitated, her confidence wavering. "You don't understand," she repeated weakly. "No, Cindy, I understand perfectly," I said, my voice like ice. "You didn't want to fix anything. You wanted an escape. And instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix what was broken, you decided to burn everything to the ground." Her face twisted with frustration, and for a moment, I thought she might apologize. But instead, she doubled down. "You weren't there for me, Henry," she said, her voice rising. "You can't act like you were some perfect husband. You pushed me away." I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "I wasn't perfect. Fine. But I didn't cheat on you, Cindy. I didn't lie to you. I didn't make a mockery of the vows we took." The room fell silent, the weight of my words pressing down on both of us. Cindy's arms fell to her sides, and she looked away, unable to meet my eyes. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of regret. But then she looked back at me, her face cold and unreadable. "So what now?" she asked, her voice flat. "You're just going to throw everything away because of one mistake?" "One mistake," I repeated, incredulous. "This isn't a mistake, Cindy. This is a choice. A series of choices you made over and over, knowing exactly what you were doing." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't say another word. I'm done listening to your excuses." She stared at me, her expression shifting between anger and something that almost looked like fear. "You can't mean that," she said softly. "Henry, we've been together for years. You're really going to throw that away?" "I'm not the one who threw it away," I said, my voice steady. "You did that the moment you chose him over me." The silence that followed was deafening. Cindy looked at me, her eyes searching for something. Sympathy, forgiveness, a way out. But I had nothing left to give her. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there alone. As I climbed the stairs, the weight of the confrontation settled over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Our life together would never be the same. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. The confrontation had brought some truths to light, but Cindy's deflections, her accusations, they only scratched the surface of what she was hiding. The next day, fueled by anger and the need for answers, I sat down at my desk and logged into our joint bank account. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The balance was lower than I remembered, but not alarmingly so. It wasn't until I started going through the transaction history that the truth began to unravel. Over the past 6 months, there were dozens of small withdrawals, just enough to avoid raising suspicion, but they added up quickly. $200 here, $300 there, sometimes 2 or 3 times in the same week. My pulse quickened as I clicked through each entry. The amounts totaled over $50,000. I opened another tab and began cross-referencing the withdrawals with credit card charges. That's when the real picture emerged. Checks written to upscale hotels. Payments to jewelry stores I'd never heard of. Flights booked to destinations that had nothing to do with work or family. The receipts told a story I didn't want to believe. Cindy had been financing their dates, their escapades, with my money. My hands shook as I sifted through the evidence. Every line item felt like a new betrayal, another piece of my trust shattered beyond repair. The lingerie I'd seen in her suitcase was just the tip of the iceberg. She'd bought expensive perfumes, fine dining experiences, even a weekend getaway to a luxury resort. It was all there, meticulously hidden in the folds of our finances, but now laid bare before me. By the time I confronted her that evening, I was barely holding it together. She walked into the house like nothing had happened, her purse slung casually over her shoulder. But the moment she saw me standing in the living room with a stack of printed statements in my hand, her expression shifted. "Cindy," I said, my voice low but steady, "we need to talk." Her eyes darted to the papers, then back to me. "What is it now?" she asked, trying to sound annoyed, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. I held up the stack of documents, pages fanned out like a deck of cards. "You want to explain this?" She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she tried to gauge how much I knew. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," I snapped, my voice rising. "The withdrawals, the checks, the flights."
$52,000, Cindy.
50,000 of our money. You've been using it to fund your little affair. Her face went pale, her mask of indifference slipping. "Henry, Save it," I interrupted, tossing the papers onto the coffee table. "You spent my money, our money, on him. Do you have any idea what you've done? How could you? How could you betray me like this?" Her lips quivered, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then the tears started. Big, heavy sobs that racked her body as she collapsed onto the couch. "It wasn't like that," she choked out between sobs. "It wasn't about the money. It was just a way to escape the routine." "The routine," I repeated, my voice incredulous. "You're telling me you blew through 50 grand because you were bored? That's your excuse." She buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled. "You don't understand. I felt trapped, Henry. Stuck in this life where everything is predictable, boring. Jack made me feel alive again. He made me feel like I mattered." "Alive!" I shouted, pacing the room as the anger bubbled to the surface. "You think this is about feeling alive? You lied to me. You cheated on me. You stole from me, Cindy. Do you have any idea what you've done to us? To me?" Her sobs grew louder, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. "Not this time. I trusted you," I continued, my voice cracking. "I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for him. For some guy who has no problem ruining another man's life. It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered, looking up at me with tear-streaked cheeks. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." "But it did," I said coldly. "It did, Cindy. And now you have to live with the consequences." She looked at me, Her eyes filled with a desperation I hadn't seen before. Please, Henry, don't do this. We can fix this. I can fix this. Just give me a chance. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Fix this? You think this can be fixed? Cindy, there's nothing left to fix. You've destroyed everything we built together. Everything I thought we had. Her tears fell silently as she realized the weight of my words. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice steady but hollow. And I'm taking everything. The house, the savings, everything. You don't deserve any of it. She gasped, shaking her head. You can't do that. Henry, please. I can, I said firmly, cutting her off. And I will. You made your choices, Cindy. Now you get to live with them. I turned and walked away, leaving her sobbing on the couch. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity, a sliver of peace amidst the chaos. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I was done being the fool. Cindy had taken enough from me. She wasn't going to take anything more. The morning after our explosive confrontation, I walked into my lawyer's office with a folder stuffed full of evidence. The photos, the bank statements, the recorded conversations, it was all there. Every ounce of betrayal documented in painstaking detail. My lawyer, Sarah, looked over the file with a mix of professional detachment and quiet satisfaction. This is rock solid, she said, flipping through the pages. You've got everything you need to make this case airtight. Honestly, she doesn't stand a chance. Hearing those words should have made me feel better, vindicated even. But as I sat there across from Sarah, all I felt was exhaustion. This wasn't how I imagined my marriage ending. I signed the papers that afternoon, officially filing for divorce. The decision felt like a final nail in the coffin, a point of no return. Cindy didn't know yet, but she would soon. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. Cindy wasn't there, which gave me the time I needed to process what I'd just done. I stood in the living room, staring at the spot where we used to sit together, laughing at old movies and making plans for the future. Now it felt like those memories belonged to someone else entirely, to a life I no longer recognized. Later that evening, Cindy came home. She walked through the door with a hesitant smile, as if she thought things might have blown over. When she saw the envelope sitting on the coffee table, her expression faltered. "What's this?" she asked, picking it up. "Divorce papers," I said, my voice flat. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope, scanning the documents inside. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "You're serious?" "Completely," I said. "This is over, Cindy. You made sure of that." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "Henry, please, don't do this. We can fix things. I can fix things." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the stillness of the room. "Fix things? Cindy, there's no fixing this. You didn't just betray me. You stole from me, lied to me, laughed at me behind my back. There's nothing left to save." Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded with me. "I'll do anything, Henry. I'll go to therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us." But her words fell on deaf ears. I had already given her everything I had, and she had thrown it all away. "You didn't care about us when you were sneaking around with Jack," I said coldly. "You didn't care about us when you drained our account to fund your little affair. Don't act like you care now." By the end of the week, Cindy had no choice but to face reality. Her things were packed into boxes, stacked neatly by the front door. I told her she had until Friday to get her belongings out of the house. The final blow came when I saw Jack's car pull into the driveway. A sleek, black sedan with tinted windows, the kind of car that screamed arrogance. My fists clenched at my sides as he stepped out, wearing the same smug expression I remembered from the day I saw them together. Cindy came down the stairs, carrying the last of her bags. She paused when she saw me standing there, her eyes searching mine for something. Regret, forgiveness, anything to cling to. "I'm sorry, Henry," she said softly. I didn't respond. Couldn't. Her words felt hollow, too little and far too late. Jack leaned against his car, watching us with a lazy grin. It took everything in me not to walk over and wipe that look off his face. But I held back. He wasn't worth it. Neither of them were. Cindy hesitated for a moment before stepping outside. She loaded her bags into the car without looking back. When she climbed into the passenger seat, Jack leaned over to say something to her, and she laughed. That laugh was the last thing I heard before they drove away, leaving behind an empty driveway and a house full of memories that no longer felt like mine. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where their car had disappeared down the street. It was over. The marriage, the betrayal, the life we'd built together, it was all gone. All that was left were ruins. And for the first time in weeks, I realized I was ready to rebuild, even if it meant starting from nothing. The months after Cindy left were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. The house felt cavernous, filled with too many reminders of a life that no longer existed. At first, I thought I could manage, push through the pain, go through the motions, but the silence had a way of amplifying everything I wanted to forget. I sold the house 3 months after the divorce was finalized. It wasn't just about leaving the memories behind. It was about starting fresh. The house had been a symbol of the life I thought we were building together, but now it felt like a monument to lies and betrayal. The day I handed over the keys, I didn't feel sadness. I felt relief. Moving to a new city was a leap of faith. I didn't know anyone there, didn't have much of a plan beyond finding a job and a small apartment. But for the first time in years, I felt something that had eluded me for so long: freedom. The first few weeks were an adjustment. I worked long hours at a new job, trying to keep my mind busy and my heart numb. I explored the city on weekends, walking aimlessly through parks, museums, and bustling streets. It was a quiet existence, but it was mine. One Friday night, I found myself at a small bar tucked away on a side street. It wasn't the kind of place I usually went to, dimly lit with soft music and a crowd that seemed more interested in conversation than chaos. I sat at the bar nursing a whiskey, watching the world move around me. That's when I saw her. She was sitting a few stools down, laughing at something the bartender had said. Her laughter wasn't forced or overly polished. It was genuine, the kind that lit up her face and softened the edges of the room. Her name was Amanda. I don't know what compelled me to strike up a conversation. Maybe it was the way she smiled, or the way she seemed so completely at ease with herself. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about Cindy or Jack or everything I'd lost. We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. She told me about her job as a graphic designer, her love of photography, and the road trip she'd recently taken along the coast. I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't expected, telling her about my move, my work, even bits and pieces of the pain I was still working through. Amanda didn't judge or offer empty platitudes. She just listened, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. When the bar closed, we walked outside together, the cool night air wrapping around us. She gave me a small smile, one that felt like a promise of something more. "Maybe I'll see you around," she said. "Yeah," I replied, my own smile feeling unfamiliar but welcome. "I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, we saw each other again. Coffee turned into dinners, and dinners turned into long walks through the city. Amanda wasn't just kind. She was thoughtful, curious, and full of a quiet strength that inspired me. For the first time, I felt the weight of the past beginning to lift. The bitterness, the anger, the constant replaying of everything that had gone wrong. They were still there, but they no longer consumed me. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Amanda turned to me and asked, "Do you ever think about what brought you here? To this city, I mean." I hesitated, staring at the fading light on the horizon. "Yeah," I said finally.
Ido.
"A lot." "And?" she prompted gently. I looked at her, at the way the golden light framed her face, and smiled. "I think I lost everything to find myself," I said. "And maybe that's what I needed." She nodded, her hand brushing against mine. Sometimes, starting over is the only way to move forward. As the sun dipped below the skyline, I realized that Amanda was right. The betrayal I'd endured hadn't destroyed me. It had stripped me down to my core, forcing me to rebuild piece by piece. And now, with every step I took, I felt a little stronger, a little more whole. Cindy and Jack were just a chapter in my story, not the whole book. That chapter was over, and for the first time, I was excited to see what the next one would hold. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself. And now, as I held Amanda's hand, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be.